Are we well and truly hooked up and we know where we're, and everybody can hear me? I'm not sure whether I'm talking from this mic or from this one. But good morning, good day, Conference Director, the Deputy Minister of Human Settlements, Pam Chwete, in her absence here, the MEC for Human Settlements in the Free State, Mr. Kolisi Tokwana, the Mayor of Mangaung, Mr. Kolisi Sionzana, the Chairperson and the members of the Board of the South African chapter of the Institute of Human Settlements, professionals, dignitaries who've joined us from both internationally and locally, members of academia, government, and contributors to this event. Ladies and gentlemen, all protocols are observed. My name is Julieka Bayat, and may I commence this session with my absolute heartfelt greetings to everyone present at this venue, as well as to our attendees who have joined us online. It is my pleasure to be the session director for the plenary session A, at which time we will be discussing housing policy and transformational journeys in South Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, today provides us with the opportunity to start to contextualize where we come from as a country and then to point us to the trajectory that will take us to 2050. In this session, we're supposed to have 4 speakers. I must apologize because I believe one of our speakers is having problems in trying to join us online. But all speakers to the session have distinguished themselves as subject matter specialists who have made and continue to make meaningful contributions to the discourse relating to human settlements, both nationally and internationally. I therefore offer a special word of welcome to this session to the panel members who are Professor Ivan Turok, Professor Leslie Bank. I believe Professor Alan Mabin has a problem, but we'll see if he can join us. And Mr. Fred Kusambizi, who's the CEO of Planact. Ladies and gentlemen, in order to save time, I will not read out the biographies of each one of the speakers, but I urge each and every one of you to please go to the conference platform and familiarize yourself with the biographies of each one of the speakers. As we are aware, our democracy brought the delivery of housing opportunities for the poorest of the poor and planned human settlements within the context of the policies and the procedures that are set out in the National Housing Code. Now, after 28 years, we have learned many lessons and we have experienced many challenges. I believe that our speakers will indicate where we come from and will take us through where we are moving to. Our speakers will also look at the status quo. They will provide us with their observations and viewpoints. They will provoke thought. They will assist us to generate solutions that will find their way into government's national agenda as we prepare for the 2050 National Strategic Plan and Agenda for Human Settlements. I am particularly interested in the insights that they will be sharing with us. Ladies and gentlemen, for this session, we have been allocated the time frame of 12 to 1 o'clock. So in order to be as efficient as possible, I would like each speaker to utilize the maximum time that we had initially allocated, a maximum of 10 minutes. But if we are unable to have Prof. Mabin with us, I will be generous and allow the other speakers a little more time. I must say I've actually had discussions with them and I said, no, I'm not giving you any more time. But it looks like I've got to go back on what I've said. I will expect them during that time to go through their areas of discussion as succinctly as they possibly can. I will, at the end of probably 9 or 10 minutes, depending on whether we can give the speakers extra time or not, I will ask the speaker to make their final thoughts in order that we can just ensure that we stick to the time frame. After every speaker has spoken, I will allow questions from the floor as well as from our online attendees. But what I'm going to ask is, since we have only 1 hour in order to discuss an extensive topic, I'm going to ask each one of you who are going to ask questions to kindly prepare very pointed questions so that we are able to take as many questions as possible. And after that, our panel members will be able to respond. I will now leave the speakers to discuss housing policy, transformational journeys in South Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Professor Ivan Turok from the University of the Free State, who will talk to us about small-scale affordable rental housing. Thank you, Prof. Turok. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a great pleasure to be with you today, colleagues. And I want to share with you, what's it giving me a funny option? I want to share with you some work, some research that I have been doing with colleagues for, in fact, quite a long time now. I hope you can see my screen all right. I think I'll probably better switch off my video.
We're able to see you, Prof.
Excellent.
Thank you.
So what I want to talk about, a very dynamic phenomenon happening in South African cities and townships in particular at the moment. But it's a phenomenon that's pretty much neglected by policymakers and practitioners. And I want to argue that this idea, for various reasons, it's a phenomenon whose time has come, and we must take it much more seriously. It reflects grassroots action by people doing things for themselves. But as I say, it's almost a complete policy vacuum, this phenomenon, except for a few municipalities who are beginning to take it more seriously. So I'm going to draw upon, in my 10 minutes, a report that my colleague and I recently completed with the Development Action Group, a very important NGO in Cape Town working on this particular phenomenon and taking it very seriously. I also want to talk about ongoing work, or draw upon ongoing work with the City Support Program on township economic development. And what we're seeing, colleagues, putting it simply, is a transformation of backyard shacks, which conventionally are made of substandard materials, zinc and iron sheets, or Wendy houses, wooden Wendy houses, where people are forced to share toilets, taps, and other services, which are very low cost. So that's an advantage, but the quality of life of people living in crowded backyards is not great. So we're seeing this transformation in many of our townships into small-scale blocks of rental units. They're made of bricks and mortar, so they're much more solid. They provide, by and large, services to individual households internally rather than shared in the yard. They represent a larger scale of investment, obviously, than informal structures. And they are a valuable route forward to sustainable densification of our townships. But they vary enormously in terms of quality. All right, so on the left, we can see some very haphazard structures that reflect the way these blocks are funded. Basically, on the left, up and down, the owner of this property has been adding extensions and extra room to the property as he generates more income from the rent. So the whole structure is poorly planned at the outset, and he struggles to improvise with access ladders and other staircases and other phenomenon to ensure that the building stands and is structurally sound. It's a real struggle, this way of funding this kind of phenomenon. The other pictures show similarly problematic structures in various ways, right? So that's at the bottom end of the spectrum. At the top end are these high quality structures I showed in the first slide. But there are some drawbacks of this phenomenon that is neglected by municipalities and by provincial and national government. The four key drawbacks of this phenomenon are the health and safety standards are sometimes compromised by the pressures that exist in very dense and overcrowded areas like this. Buildings at risk of falling down, I showed you an example. The pressure on public services from having a population that might be 5 or 10 times larger than the original planned population for that settlement creates problems with the sewage network, with the water and electricity networks. There's a risk of overcrowding and of exploitation of tenants by landlords who are unregulated. And the problem for the property values is that owners do not recover often the value of these properties. They pay no rates or taxes because the whole phenomenon is informal and unregulated. So that's a missed opportunity in various ways. And I argue, and we argue in the report I mentioned, that actually we're at a crossroads with this phenomenon. If we do nothing, if we continue to neglect what's happening on the ground, we are going to create very problematic townships of overcrowding, where people are very insecure and where there's great instability because of the breakdown of public services in particular. But there's this opportunity to create the high road scenario of sustainable densification with vibrant neighborhoods and much more livable environments with better public services. But to shift the trajectory needs multiple actions and reforms. At the moment, the current regulatory system encourages people not to comply because it's too prohibitive in various ways that I'll explain now briefly. Essentially, the rules and procedures that manage our townships inhibit people from following the procedures, the regulations. They inhibit compliance. They make it too costly and too slow and too difficult for people to follow the rules. In particular, planning approvals are very costly and time-consuming for people to rezone their properties to multiple rental units. They also have to pay development contributions for the additional infrastructure they use, but these have to be paid right up front, so the cost is prohibitive. Our national building regulations are inappropriate in terms of the norms and standards for relatively low-cost housing, and applying for building approval is a very cumbersome process as well. Title deeds are a vital first step to formalization, but they are missing in the majority of cases for a variety of reasons, including deceased estates and the fact that people are selling properties informally. And the governance and administration of our townships is also inadequate in terms of capabilities and the staff and the mindsets in particular of municipal officials, which are not sympathetic to what's going on, which creates enormous public mistrust. So what needs to be done? On planning approvals, we need to streamline the system. We need to create overlay zones, which mean that people don't need to apply for rezoning for residential use. We need to subsidize the fees charged to apply for planning approval. And we could use the Urban Settlements Development Grant to fund the upgraded infrastructure required in these areas. On national building regulations, we need to simplify these so that the standards are realistic for low-cost housing. We need to provide prototype building plans so that emerging developers can easily submit plans to the authorities and get approval. On title deeds, this is more complicated. We've got to work case by case to rectify where there are problems, but we also need systematic interventions to simplify the procedures. And Operation Vulindlela is beginning this task, which is good to know. On governance administration, we need to create local housing support centers to give people advice about how to follow the rules. We need a new social contract for urban management in these areas so that they become livable and people accept and buy into the system of urban management. So summing up, we need a two-pronged approach. We need to think about the progressive regularization of existing buildings which don't comply. That means increasing the awareness of developers, providing minor improvements so that they can be safe, these structures, so that the infrastructure won't collapse, particularly for very small scale developers. And then when it comes to new buildings, we've got to try and get ahead of the curve by simplifying the regulatory framework to enable people to comply. And that is possible, and there is work being done to show the kinds of reforms that would enable this to happen. So by doing this kind of policy reform, we can create a positive cycle in our townships. Better housing, more livable and sustainable neighborhoods. We can increase municipal income in the process, because these are very valuable properties potentially, to reinvest in the public goods and services in our townships, to create this virtuous circle of upgrading and more vibrant and livable environments. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Professor Turok, for your very, very informative and forward-thinking and also very pithy presentation, and for taking us through the large number of issues that relate to affordable rental housing, and especially in the informal sector. Prof, you have given us the opportunity to mull over different aspects that relate to affordable rental housing, and we appreciate your proposals that are very important in terms of the actions and regulatory guidelines that will assist to manage the impact of rental accommodation in the urban space. We really look forward to more work as far as that is concerned. Ladies and gentlemen, may I now please introduce our second speaker, Professor Leslie Bank from the Human Sciences Research Council, who will talk to us about journeys in public housing, a view from the periphery. Prof. Bank, over to you, sir.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. Let me see whether I can do. There we go. Okay. Is that visible?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Okay. What I want to talk about today is a little bit of a reflection. It's quite good that Ivan spoke about the urban situation. I want to talk about rural housing a little bit. And I'd like to admit that I'm a little bit out of touch with what's been going on in the rural housing area. And maybe this is an opportunity for people that are tuned in to make contact with me, because I have a new grant to put 10 researchers in rural areas in the Eastern Cape for 10 months. And in that process, they have other things to investigate, but it would be very useful if they could do some work on settlement, motivations for settlement, styles of settlement, issues related to services and so on, and contribute to rural housing. So let me try and be good. Oh, there we go. Okay, I'll just, I'm timing myself. That's been a minute or so. So my journey into public housing really began in the 1990s when I was working at the ISCR at Rhodes University in the Eastern Cape, really just before the democratic transition, and there was a dramatically changing landscape, settlement landscape in areas, the former Transkei and Ciskei and the Platteland towns and regional metros. And I ended up for about 5 years crisscrossing the province, visiting many of these places, meeting community groups, working with NGOs to try and describe these changing forms so that we could figure out how to advise policy. The policy format tended to, as it turned out, tended to be fairly formulaic and rigid and didn't quite match the diversity of situations. But I can remember very clearly one evening moving to, you can't see my text, but being asked to go and see what was going on in Ndondo Square in Thala in the northwestern Transkei. And as I kind of came over the hill in my little white Mazda, I saw emblazoned on the town hall, one settler, one bullet. And I had in my pocket the phone number of Mbambo, who was a friend of Lungasili and Savezas, who was my contact person. So, I mean, there were some very hair-raising and very tense times. In the Platteland towns, the main issues were around town commonages, which had historically been leased to local commercial farmers, often for very little, but were now occupied by farm workers, many of them casualized or actually evicted, with a desire to get on with some stock farming. Local councils in those days, transitional councils, were trying to push these squatters off and often used things like water access as a means to apply pressure. Let me go on to the next slide. I think a lot of the debate was about how these areas and infrastructures could be abused by big capital and neoliberalism, when the overall impression was that they were really in a poor state and they lacked capital investment generally. I clearly remember in relation to rural housing that there was a very big, big provincial summit with national representation held at Elliotdale in 2008. And that the main function of the summit was to illustrate a new format for rural housing that was going to be implemented in Elliotdale. And the format was really very suburban. The models that were on the boards and in the master plans really looked a lot like a kind of suburb of Johannesburg or a part of Sandton, etc. In the meantime, there was really a lot of debate within those gathered there, which included NGOs and others, about what sorts of appropriate interventions might be galvanized through the housing subsidy, including fencing, obviously JoJo tanks, solar panels, and the way to kind of drive rural livelihoods as opposed to simply shelter. At a political level, there's a lot of concern in the province that the big urbanized provinces like Gauteng were taking the lion's share of the housing budget, and this was really a big opportunity missed by places like the Eastern Cape. And there was a sense that if we couldn't find a way or a format for rural housing to be delivered on scale, we would be missing out on such an opportunity. Most of the rural housing projects at the time seemed to fail, largely because of a lack of capacity in small municipalities. There just were not enough engineers and housing officials that were dexterous in relation to the policy instruments to bring projects to fruition. So we had a scorecard usually of dozens of block projects in these rural areas. Yeah, the overriding impression was there was a sense that each municipality should gain in some way from the available housing budget. And this seemed to often be more of a priority than the idea of targeting specific strategic housing areas or objectives in the province. In the metros, also worked quite a lot in the metros where there were different forms. Again, this question of diversity of need, ranging from the initial impulse to rehouse migrants in single-sex hostels was one of the first kind of real priorities as far as urban housing was concerned in these metros. But there were very different needs and demands on the periphery. The youth that had decompressed out of the settlements were living in adjacent areas, and they were They were moving to and fro from the parents' houses. There was already a lot of backyard shack settlement. And I guess the main function of this slide was really to show that there were really diverse needs, and provincially, the capacity to deliver really a kind of single RDP product rather better in the metros than in some of the small towns, and really not at all in the rural areas. And the whole understanding for a long time of rural housing was really what it meant was housing in small towns as opposed to housing on farms, or public housing on farms, or alternatively housing in communal areas. So one of the things that I have written about and seems to be significant, particularly in view of the pandemic, in the light of the pandemic, is the sort of hidden landscapes of investment in housing that have emerged in many of the rural areas in South Africa, not only in the Eastern Cape, but across the former homeland areas in particular. And this is driven by, has been driven by income or grants or remittances that families have used rather than state resources. Although, as Ivan mentioned in his talk, people have been located in RDP housing estates have often been able to generate rent from backyards, and sometimes have invested portions of that income in their rural homes as opposed to expanding or upgrading their opportunities in the city. So there's several observations that are made in relation to that in the work that I've done, which indicates that women are often really at the center of this drive to reconstruct rural homes. They use informal savings clubs to raise funds. They take these actions often in the name of their parents or their children, saying that, you know, our families cannot live in these old style rural dwellings in rural areas, that we need to show those in our villages and our communities from which we come, how we've progressed since democracy. And this is, there are also other aspects of these organic transformations, such as the concentration of dwellings on single sites. So sites often develop compound-like structures because more than one member of the family builds a house there, when in the past they would have sprawled out by getting new sites. And those kind of trends are related to family dynamics, kinship, but also rural security issues and the like. There is now a growing literature on extended urbanization, but largely by geographers, and I really would recommend that that is consulted.
Prof?
Okay.
Do you mind if we stop at this point, because you've had 10 minutes already, and if we have a bit of time later on, if we might be able to get you to help discuss this.
If I could just make one say one sentence at the end. I think that the pandemic, which has locked people down in urban and rural settings, has really brought this whole migratory and circular pattern of settlement into question, and that really provides us with an opportunity to possibly revisit rural housing issues, and that's what I wanted to end with. But thanks very much for the time.
Thank you very much, Professor Bank, for sharing your thought-provoking perspectives, for your involvement in the work that relates to the realities relating to the rural landscape, as well as for your thoughts about persons who enter the urban space in search of better amenities, better infrastructure, job opportunities. This is the reality of the South African way of life. Prof, also thank you for providing us with food for thought in the area where our policymakers will definitely benefit from your counsel on the issues that relate to the phenomenon of urban migratory patterns in South Africa, and the part that the lives of many South Africans play, and particularly the role that women play in this exercise. Malibongwe. Wow. Thank you, Prof, also for the offer to the researchers who might be able to work with you. If it is in order, may we share your details with the researchers who may be interested in undertaking the research in the rural space. And we can do that once Prof has given us permission to do that. Ladies and gentlemen, can we just proceed? I think at this stage I'd like to proceed. And can I just ask Thando whether Prof Alan Mabin has been able to join us? Or are we still having difficulties? Because Prof Mabin had difficulties with... Prof Mabin, is that you? Professor Mabin, is that you?
That's me.
Oh, wonderful. Ladies and gentlemen, then may I introduce our third speaker, Professor Alan Mabin from the University of the Witwatersrand, who will speak to us about housing policy and social transformation in South Africa and elsewhere. Thank you very much, and thank you for being here, Prof. I was getting worried because this is such an important area that I really did not want us in this conference to miss out on. Thank you. Over to you, Prof. Thank you.
Thanks very much for the opportunity to all concerned. I probably make terrible mistakes about protocol, but in particular, thanks to Professor Mbonga and all the people who've been working on the program. I'm going to be very brief on the assumption you can see my slides.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
I'm going to step slightly back in thinking about how we think about housing policy and its relationship to social transformation. I think the big picture is to notice that we are hardly alone in South Africa. As our colleague Deborah Potts, who's worked in Southern Africa and Europe and elsewhere for decades on questions that relate to housing and migration and daily life, writes in her book, Broken Cities, she notes that the gap between housing costs and incomes is getting worse, probably worldwide. There may be some exceptions, but we are certainly not accepted from that. And that gap is precisely what gives us the housing problem today. Now, my contribution is simply to argue for thinking more carefully, not in order to produce immediate solutions, but to enrich our thinking, to re-examine histories of housing, whether around the world, whether across the African continent, whether in South Africa, to re-examine how we have ended up in the circumstances that we're in, and in particular, to examine how public policy has contributed to the issues that face us today. And I'm inspired in saying that by Jacob Dlamini, historian Jacob Dlamini's view that we can reinterpret the artifacts, the ideas, the documents, the thinking, the archives from the past. We can reinterpret those and develop less conventional ways of thinking. In other words, we need new ways to think about the past. And a couple of years ago, Leslie Bank indulged in a little bit of personal reminiscence. I'll do the same for a moment. I woke up in the early months of the lockdown in 2020 one morning thinking about the date, and it struck me that it was exactly 100 years since the old segregated, unfortunate Parliament of South Africa passed the first Housing Act in 1920. So it happens, of course, that followed also the global influenza epidemic, which killed maybe even 1 million people in South Africa, let alone around the world. So the circumstances very different 100 years ago, but at the same time, the same issue. What's the role of public policy? What's the role of public practice? What's the role of public spending in relation to housing? And in particular, not restricting the idea. And this is really, in a way, parallel to the argument Ivan Turok's been making today. It's not just a question of the physical house. It's a question of how this fits into the society and the place of the beneficiaries of shelter in the broader society. Now, anybody can find, and if you can't, you're welcome to ask me for a copy of it. So I'm sure that the editors of Urban Forum wouldn't mind an audience like this having access to the journal. This is the article that I published in 2020, not celebrating the 100 years, but trying to explore and rethink what we could see across the themes of public health, social control, racism, segregation, but also the social democratic, statist and anti-statist ideas that traced through this long period and generated the arguments and the outcomes that we saw over that century, including in the more recent past. And it's against that backdrop that I want to ask the question, has public housing policy contributed to social transformation? And of course, problematically, negatively, and in many ways, starting from social segregation, in which South Africa is a glaringly bad example, as well as in several other African countries and internationally. Public housing policy has frequently contributed negatively to social transformation, including deepening income inequality, increasing forms of exclusion, at least for some parts of the population. There are many difficult effects. But if we look around the world, if we look at Austria in the 1930s, before terrible disaster struck that country, if we explore what's happened in recent housing policy in some African countries, including, say, Senegal, Tanzania, we can see that new attempts have been made in trying to enhance opportunity for beneficiaries and reducing social exclusion. And there are examples around the world and to some extent across Africa, and perhaps in the South African past, despite the difficulties of our past, in which public housing practice has contributed possibly more positively to social transformations in directions that the vast majority of people would desire. Whoops, I've gone backwards, apologies. So there's no easy answer to these questions. And the key point that I'm making as I conclude is that rethinking the histories of public housing action around the world, across Africa and in South Africa, may be helpful in deepening the way we approach these questions, not necessarily in generating immediate solutions, which for many people in this audience, I realize that's the issue. What are we going to do tomorrow? What are we going to do next month? Well, hopefully have some celebrations at the end of the year. What are we going to do next year? What are we going to do over the next 10 years? What are we going to do by 2050 to catch on the theme that our chairperson suggested at the beginning of the session? It's a process that must continue. And to this end of trying to find lines that connect our histories to public housing action and social transformation in the future, together with a group of researchers, we will be producing a special issue of the journal Transformation, South African journal Transformation, Critical Perspectives on Southern Africa. And there we have a variety of authors exploring pasts, presents, and futures of public housing action, public housing materialities, public housing thinking around the world, across Africa and in South Africa. So I'm not suggesting wait on time, but I'm saying these are long-term processes in which thinking carefully about our histories, about histories around the globe, can contribute to deepening the way in which we approach these issues today. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you all.
Thank you, Professor Mabin, for sharing your insightful thoughts with us. Certainly, since the apartheid era, we can talk about how housing policies have certainly contributed to some social transformation in this country. There have been issues as far as peripheral planning, and all of those kinds of things that certainly need to be readdressed as going forward. The provision of housing has certainly not been without its challenges, but we have come some way, and we believe that we can. That transformation of our social fabric, there's still lots of space for us to be able to achieve that. We will certainly need to re-examine our thoughts on public policy and to achieve the appropriate human settlement policies that will transform society. Thank you, Prof. Mabin. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now my pleasure to introduce you to our fourth speaker, Mr. Fred Kusambizi, who is the CEO of Planact, an NGO. And as Mr. Kusambizi gets ready, I just want to say that I believe that the NGOs play a critical role in bringing in the conscience factor to government-led processes. Mr. Kusambizi will speak to us about citizens' involvement during housing policy and transformation. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. All protocol observed. I'll begin by playing a short video depicting what beneficiaries can do for themselves when they're given space. And then I'll give a short talk to the
One of the areas that we took the social audit methodology is in a community called Wardville in the city of Ekurhuleni. The informal settlement of home seekers had a number of problems that they felt the use of social audit can assist them. Even though our training was based on introducing the methodology and the principles, they picked out the one aspect which is about access to information, and they were able to use it for the benefit of one of the problems, which was housing. Mase siphumile sesifumene elisizo kwi-sanitation sabona ba le social audit iyasebenzela futhi isebenzele kakhulu. Sabe sinolwazi oluncinci besiluvela uba kunezindlu ezizakwakhiwa eChief Luthuli extension 4. Ezo zindlu futhi bazakhelwe thina singabantu basehome seekers Squatter Camp. Lapho sithathe khona le social audit yethu sawungena ngayo eminyangweni ke ngoku sihambe sifuna ukwazi bafuthi basingene ngapi masifuna indaba yezindlu. Sihambe sinoka saza gqibeleni safumana umnyango wona futhi basingene kuwo. Saqala ke sagubhurula ke ngoku izinto uba kwenziwa kanjani, zingaphi ezindlu ziphi zakhiwa nini kanjani. Sayifumana yonke le information sisebenzisa olwazi esilifumene kwi-social audit. As we speak today, there is 127 of them that managed to get their houses, and there is a whole lot of others that are still waiting. But the fact remains, if they didn't know what kind of questions to ask from the human settlement officials, they would be still stuck today because they have been waiting for long.
Ukunkonkotha umnyango oqala akuzange kusabanzima kangako ngoba thina bese sifundisiwe vele, so amagama besibatshela wona abantu bomasipala bebebona ukuthi lakithi vele sebesengozini. Umfutho esibe nawo siuthole ngalabantu ababesifundisile ngoba silokhu sibalandela singabaphumuzile nakancane. Silo sibatshela ukuthi sifuna into yethu le manje sesishayile isikhathi sokuthi ngabe kwathi uyaphela, sesayifuna ukuthi ngabe seyiphelile manje.
Silwile sihamba indlela kunzima, indawo zisenyukela. Kodwa manje sisezindlini zethu besingazi ba namhlanje umuntu obe ulele kwakhe uya-owna ulele nabantwana bakhe endlini yakhe. Like sibonga ukubambisana, sibonge ne-social audit.
Ngosuku lokuqala ngalala ngathi mangiphaphama ngoba phela mina umqondo wami bese ujwayele emkhukhwini. uma sihlala emkhukhwini yonke into ubuyenza nje ndawonye ingenamehluko ukuthi ngapha la uphekela ngakhona ngapha la ugezela ngakhona emkhukhwini nje kunalokho uma uhlala emkhukhwini. Ngizizwa ngijabulile manje ngoba senginekhaya nje lapha eGoli ngoba eGoli ila kutholakala khona amathuba amaningi okusebenza futhi kakhulukazi ngoba ngikhulisa abantwana nami ekugcineni abantwana bami ngifuna bethole usizo olungcono bangafani nami mina ngoba angizange ngithole imfundo right.
So Planact is very happy that the intention that we went to Wattville with to advocate for sanitation, better sanitation for informal settlements, has helped the community of home seekers to also talk more about better housing for themselves.
Thank you very much then, ladies and gentlemen. If we've had our speakers, and what I'd like to do now is open the floor to questions. And again, thank you to our speakers, and our speakers can bear in mind just what it is that is being asked. And I believe that someone's going to be taking down the questions, and it's going to be relayed on WhatsApp to the speakers. Am I correct? I believe that is the way we're going to be doing it. But also, can I have people from the floor, the attendees, will you kindly raise your hands and let us know so that I can identify who's going to be asked. I will take 3 questions from the floor, and then we will go online and take 3 questions online. I ask you, please, in terms of our times, may we please just questions very pithy, very to the point. Thank you very much. First speaker, over to you, sir. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Chairperson.
Sorry, can I just say, can you please identify yourself first of all, so that we know who's asking the question? Thank you.
That's where I was going. This is Dr. Pedro Mzileni from the University of Free State. I just have the 2 quick questions directed to Prof. Turok and also Prof. Bank. The structures that Prof. Turok presented about the latest small-scale developments taking place in the township and how they all look rising up and so on. A good presentation, but also with areas of concerns, because one, you have a crisis in the township where there isn't any inflow of capital. Incomes are extremely depreciating and disappearing from that space, and that is creating a social reproduction crisis that gets manifested by constant instances of crime and violence and so on. In fact, the structures you presented, if you remember the case of Enyobeni in June this year, it was that exact structure where that tragedy took place. So not only is housing a matter of concrete and cement, but also the socio-economic relations taking place in the space that are becoming very precarious because of how the township has collapsed in terms of lack of flows of capital into the even the very decision of running a township, a tavern in that kind of a structure shows the crisis of how capital isn't flowing into the area. So doesn't he think rather the best model that could restore people's dignity in terms of houses is rather taking a more radical approach of expropriating urban land that is available for more conducive land space for people to build imizi, babenezidima namakhaya nentsapho zabo, because that is how we understand housing as the black majority in this country. So an element of decoloniality for me is highly lacking. But quickly, let me go to Prof. Bank. Prof. Bank, yes, big capital flowed into the rural areas and it collapsed local economic development and so on. But don't you think that there was a form of capital in the rural area that brought a form of development, although it was uneven, the process of deindustrialization, because the Eastern Cape, in terms of how it is structured today, it's a product of the factory economy of the 60s, the 50s, and the 70s, and that economy built the townships that you see across that province. It basically provided forms of employment in the province. And since the neoliberal outflows of capital in the 80s and the 90s and the deindustrialization that happened, it brought huge rates of unemployment and a collapse of living standards in the Eastern Cape to a point where now it is below the poverty line, most of the population. So my question is, did you consider the area of deindustrialization and the contributions it has made to the collapse of rural communities in the Eastern Cape, and what could be done as an intervention to restore something similar to that kind of an economy in democratic terms? I think, therefore, Prof. Mabin conceptually is responding and providing a critique for me to the first two speakers. Thanks.
All right, thank you very much for that, Doctor. Can I take one more question, because we really are running out of time, and well, you see that Mr. Kusambizi is back online, but I'd like to take the next question, and then we can go back just to get Mr. Kusambizi to complete his. Is there anybody else? All right, then can I just ask Prof. Turok, and may you please start responding, and then of course Prof. Bank, if you can then respond as well, and then we'll go back to Mr. Kusambizi. Thank you. Over to you, Prof. Turok.
Thanks very much for that excellent question. It's really quite spot on in a way. There is a social crisis in our townships, and we need to resolve that not just by interventions within the townships. He's quite right. But I want to make 2 points. The first is that what I described is a really positive dynamic, right, in all sorts of ways, not just the buildings, as Prof. Mabin said. It's not just the physical phenomenon that's taking place. It's also building capabilities in the townships, skills, jobs, incomes, emerging developers, and building contractors, right, to help transform our construction sector, which is still largely white, owned and controlled, right? That very positive dynamic of building capacity, which is why we mustn't write this off, as the question was tending to do. We must build on this phenomenon in all sorts of ways. And indeed, the second point, I would respond quite right. We will transform our cities not just by strengthening the townships, but also by intervening in the suburbs and in the core of our cities. And the starting point for that, I'm not convinced about expropriation. That will be very disruptive. We already have in all of our major cities substantial assets of public land that's unused, that's underutilized, that's wasted, and has been sitting empty for years and years. We need to use our public land to infill well-located urban areas, to consolidate our cities, to integrate our townships with our suburbs, and to transform our cities in that way. So it's a both response, using our emerging developers to build low and middle cost housing within well-located areas in our cities. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Prof. Turok. Professor Bank.
Thanks for the question or questions. I think issues of social dignity are really fundamental. I was going to get to that in relation to the pandemic. I think families across the country were challenged by the suspension of social interaction and cultural practice during the pandemic. And it does appear to me that the reconstitution of dignity and of social relations and of the capacity for social reproduction is a fundamental quest of poor people in this country, and that their connections between town and rural areas is prioritized in this process. So the human economy is actually much more intertwined than the built environment is, and that mapping out some of these connections seem to be really important at this time, whether there is, in fact, due to lockdown and the fact that people are located in particular areas now for a long time and disconnected from one another, whether there will be a kind of break in this culture of migration that has defined our society for the last 150 years and defines the strategies of poor families to survive, really, when being entrapped in a single location often proves very difficult. If you have casual work or no work, at least you have a connection to family members that have land, pensions, opportunities elsewhere. So I think a lot of the work really, I think these questions of dignity and social transformation, I think there is a kind of mismatch between the way that policy talks about settlement and place and relatedness and the way that people talk about it and live across places. So those are issues that are of interest to me, not only at an intellectual level, but I think they have profound implications for how we fashion policy in African cities and in South African cities. So, and obviously the question of deindustrialization, the loss of jobs, the loss of jobs in the Eastern Cape on a really large scale, which I have described in my book, City of Broken Dreams, which really covers that process, is I think the assumption was that new capital would flow into areas on our coastal cities and create new factories, that we would suddenly have SEZs like China after democracy. And of course, that didn't really happen. We lost a lot of jobs. And I think the key thing there from a development point of view is to appreciate historically how regional economies are made, how cities are made, and to pick out those resources, those relationships, those opportunities that positively build cities and regions. So it's a matter of reflecting, as Alan has suggested, on historical strengths and possibilities. And obviously there is a lot that is changing in terms of technology and so on. So it is, there's still a bit of thinking to do as far as that's concerned, but deindustrialization had a devastating effect on the Eastern Cape. There's no doubt about that, and I don't think it's recovered from that. And that's one of the problems.
Thank you very much for that, Professor Bank. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to re-welcome Mr. Kusambizi, who had problems with his with the connection to us. Mr. Kusambizi, are you there? And may we welcome you again, just to complete your presentation, please. Thank you.
I'm here. Thank you very much. I apologize for what just happened. I think it's the load shedding we are going through. So I won't be able to play the video, but unfortunately my small summaries all talks to the video. So what you're going to hear might be a bit disjointed. I'll just give us a quick summary, given the time that we have left. So I'll just go straight to my second slide. But I'll give a quick summary of what the video is about. My presentation talks about how citizens can get involved in housing development and how they can play a great role. In the video, it shows a community that had no housing at all, but after getting information about water and sanitation, they managed to understand that, to get to understand who their government officials were, whom they could approach to follow up with their housing development. They're all living in formal settlements. Now, but in the end, they managed to get through. It was many years, and they got housing. It's a pity you haven't seen it, but what I've done is I've posted the link. You can all look at it afterwards. Then you will understand what I'm going to conclude with. We all know what the new dispensation brought to all of us. There was great expectations to those who were mostly underprivileged, previously disadvantaged. But things didn't have to turn out as were supposed to have been. So what happened is the citizens lost hope and trust in their government because the expectations weren't met, neither were the government's intentions fulfilled. Citizens felt that they were left constantly on the peripheral, and they didn't understand. For that reason, they didn't know or understand the constraints that government was going through throughout all this trajectory. This was a very gloomy picture for them. And out of that, we've seen a number of citizens forming up, creating formations to go and, in a way, contest whatever government comes up with. There's one we all know, the biggest in the country, Abahlali Batseng Jondolo, which means people living in informal settlements or slum areas. Those plus others have come up and have come to challenge because they are not happy. But when you refer to the video I just presented, citizens who have had a chance to engage with government, who have been given a room to engage with government, have realized that working harmoniously, they can get very far. What I point out, or what is pointed out in that video, is that government, local government cannot be separated from housing development. Therefore, it means good governance within local government is very key. And the question maybe I leave to the audience is that who is responsible for the good governance within the local government? And to set the discussion is, I would say it is the humans, it is us. Whether we come with a number of different institutional arrangements, so long as the people responsible don't do what they're supposed to do, nothing will change. So I'll leave it at that, and I apologize again. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Mr. Kusambizi. You have certainly given us a very thought-provoking video, and you've spoken through the issues of the crucial role that the citizenry can play in housing development and policy transformation processes. And if I can just go back to 1993 and 1994, when we had what was called the National Housing Forum, and that process, that transformed the apartheid-era housing policies to the national housing policies of the democratic government. But that National Housing Forum would have been the poorer had there not been the involvement of civic organizations, NGOs, and representatives from political formation. So, Mr. Kusambizi, you definitely make a very important point when you say how important what important a role the citizenry plays. But there are still a lot more contributions that can be made. Ladies and gentlemen, we really don't have a lot of time. I just want to ask whether we have any questions from the online platform. Is there anybody? We have not received anything. So if that is the case, then I'd like to suggest that we proceed. And if I may then just say, ladies and gentlemen, and particularly Madam Conference Director, in closing the session, may I please express my grateful thanks to our panel of speakers, Professors Turok, Mabin and Bank, and to Mr. Kusambizi for their input to this conference. And also, very importantly, they have truncated their presentations. Despite the vast amount of experience and knowledge of the subject matter, and still, with all of that, they were still able to provide us with some important information and start to give us some thought-provoking issues that we can take forward, and also for answering the questions. I can assure you that with the kind of information that we have, you have provided very important guidance that will contribute to the enhancement of the human settlements agenda that will take us through to 2030. May I also say a very big thank you to our attendees online and also the attendees here today, And a very, very big thank you to the organizers for creating this platform in order that we can disseminate information, that we can learn from each other, and for us to be able to take the process of learning forward. Ladies and gentlemen, that just brings us to the end of the session, and I'm sure that lunch will be served in a short while. And may I close this component of the conference and say thank you very much to each and every one of you. Thank you.